Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Hi, my name's James. I'm a distinguished engineer at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. A little bit about my background. I grew up in Sydney. I spent a bunch of time in the early 2000s doing my own little startup, and then that led to about a decade working at Apple over in Cupertino, and I spent a little bit of time at AWS as well. And now I'm back here in Sydney and working for a bank. And when I'm not working, so one of my hobbies is astrophotography, and I'm also an incredibly bad musician, but I try anyway. So the original title for this session was going to be, what are you doing at the bank? And it was designed to be sort of a double meaning of, you could interpret it both as, what are you doing at the bank? And you could also interpret it as, what are you doing at the bank? Because it does seem a little bit weird to have spent a decade over in the US working at some of the biggest tech companies, and then you come back to your home country and you wind up in a heavily regulated 127-year-old company called CBA. What are you doing at the bank? So that's the point of this session. I want to tell you what we're doing at the bank, why I'm there, why I think it's important, and some of the things that we're doing and why we're doing them, and hopefully I can impart to you some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. So what are you doing at the bank? So everywhere I've worked, it has either been or we have strived to make it the place where you could do the best work of your life. Right? It's a pretty fundamental part of what I think should be a part of every employment agreement with someone. You accept the position, and that company promises to you that they're going to do their best to create the environment where you can do the best work of your life. At Apple, that was actually part of the sort of leaflet, the pack that they send you out when you're a new starter. I think when you opened up this beautiful threefold binder, one of the internal things was, please sign here to acknowledge you will do the best work of your life. Right? It was a really fundamental part of it. And of course, when you're doing a startup, right, that's just naturally what you do. You either are there to do the best work of your life, or you will fail. At Amazon, it was more like you better do the best work of your life or else. But that's just the different cultures of the different places. When I came back, I wanted a different challenge. I'd always worked in places where that notion of doing the best work of your life was fairly well established and was intrinsic to the culture. I wanted a place where the answer was, to the question of can you do the best work of your life, I wanted to join a place where the answer was not yet. There's the potential, but not yet. And there's the desire to get there, but we're not there yet. But why? Why put yourself in that position? Why actively seek out something where you can't yet do the best work of your life? Because I think when I left Australia in around 2010, 2011, I left because I felt like if you wanted to do something amazing in technology and software engineering, you had to go to the US. You had to go to Silicon Valley. That was just what you had to do. There wasn't much happening here, or at least it didn't feel like there was. And it almost felt like there was some sort of negative sentiment or something holding us back from doing really amazing things in technology, in particularly in what I felt in Sydney, may not be representative of around the country. But especially in my little bit of time at AWS, where I had teams here in Sydney, I started to get more of a glimpse of how things had changed. Right? We started to have these unicorn companies in Sydney. We started to have more presence of AWS in Sydney. There was great candidates and talent churning out of our universities that were ready to do amazing work in this space. And so I could see a transformation was happening. And I think we're at that point now where we need that next watershed moment to get that next sort of step function transformation in viewing Australia as a leading technology nation. And for me, the way I see that watershed moment happening is when we demonstrate that not only is Australia a place where you can have a startup and be really successful, not only is it a place where that startup can scale up to have global impact, not only is it a great place for a multinational to create a satellite office, but it's somewhere where the technology talent and the drive and the sheer determination is so great that even our gigantic, huge, old, heavily regulated industries and companies are able to transform themselves into high-performing, revered, and lasting software engineering organizations. And that's what we're trying to take on at CBA. It's not easy though, right? There's everyone talks about how hard it is to go from 0 to 1 in the startup sort of sense, right? You start with nothing, you work really hard, you either fail, you succeed, you go from 0 to 1. Well, if you stick with that binary analogy, let me tell you, trying to go from 1 to 1-0 is even harder. Because when you've got that existing organization, you're not just starting greenfields and building something new or taking something out to market, even if you're being incredibly disruptive. It's one of those kind of things where you're dealing with the incumbent, you're dealing with everything that's already there and working out how you transform that and bring a large amount of people along a journey with you. I should say this session is largely a stream of conscious. It is not a slide deck. The reason for that is that when I sat down and started planning this out, I realized that creating a slide deck for a talk that tries to talk about what it takes to create an engineering organization where you can do the best work of your life, that there was a little bit too much irony in that for even me to stomach. Right? Slide decks are not an inherent part of where you do the best work of your life. So unfortunately, no slides, it's just me. All right, so what am I doing? Or I should say, why am I at the bank? Because I want to create a place where it's an amazing place where you can do the best work of your life. Why? Because I believe that is super important and the next step in Australia demonstrating that we are a leading technology nation. So how do we get there? There's a couple of topics that I want to talk through with you today. First is the concept of agency and autonomy. Then we'll move on to the notion of what I call subtractive leadership. We'll talk about how an organization has to reorient itself to be ready for a more software engineering-led culture, or software engineering focus, I should say. We'll talk about the nature of purpose and vision and where that fits in the organization, where it should come from, and the importance of getting it right. And then most importantly, culture as the vehicle that brings this to life. Those elements ultimately orient us towards an org where we focus on solving problems through software engineering. Not software engineering as a function of the business that churns out software artifacts and gets stuff done, but actually a transformation within an organization where we think not of an engineering team as a functional business unit under some leadership structure, but we think of software engineering as applied problem solving that we put in all parts of the organization so that we start solving these problems at scale. So agency and autonomy. One of the most important lessons that I took away from my time at Amazon is the focus on the what, not the how. And this was drummed into us in every single meeting. If you started a planning session and you started to talk about, we're going to refactor our existing Java code base in this area to move it towards a more lightweight containerized based implementation, you'd be stopped straight away. I'd say, stop. I don't want to hear about the how. I want to hear about the what. I want to know the outcome. What outcome is that going to drive for the business? What tangible thing does it get me, right? If I'm a customer of that API that you've refactored, what will I get, right? So we were far more interested in things like this API will become twice, the latency will drop by 50%, and we will have 200% more volume to take on existing consumers, right? We were focused on the outcomes. You hear a lot about Jeff's 90-something or maybe it was early 2000s memo about, okay, guys, we are now completely an API-driven company. Everything we do will be driven by APIs. What's sometimes lost in that is there's sort of this latch on to, cool, all right, APIs are everything, cool, Jeff said, so we'll go to APIs. The subtlety that gets lost in that is what the API focus gets you. It gets you that focus on the outcomes, right? The outcome that is being provided by that API, not how that API has been implemented. When you've got those demarcation points, the thing that's really powerful about that is that when you drive that demarcation point around what and not how, something really powerful happens at an organizational level. First, you get in a mode where you can describe outcomes that will transcend the skill set of any particular business unit or function within the organization, right? If I can't describe to a finance person why what I'm doing is important to the business, if I can't describe to perhaps my non-technical stakeholder about what I'm producing and why it's important to the business, then I've got a communication problem. All right, they're not going to understand why it's important to the business, so you're probably not going to get funded. If my stakeholder doesn't understand what they're going to get, then we're probably on pretty shaky ground in terms of the level of success that we're going to get in that endeavor. So the focus on the outcome gives you that ability to have a language that's common across both technical and non-technical domains and spans multiple different areas of subject matter expertise. The powerful thing about that is that that allows the experts behind each side of those outcomes to go away and implement them in the best possible way, right? If I've got a subject matter expert that's producing a certain API and we're clear about the outcome of it, and I've got the consumer of the API that's clear about how they're going to consume that, how they implement both the creation of that API and the consumption of the API, that's completely left up to those experts. The how no longer becomes a critical part of that relationship and understanding of what's being delivered. It's only the outcomes that become important. And if we put that back in the context of why that's important in a large organization that's trying to go through a technology transformation, it's that adherence to that if you adhere to the outcomes and get really clear vision and mind share about what the outcome is that we're striving for, that helps disrupt this model of software engineers are just this lowest end of the stack, right? We've seen, traditionally in large organizations, especially ones that have been around for a long time, there tends to be an incumbent culture of, there is a solution that is desired, it will be architected, there will be perhaps a solution architect that then defines the solution a little bit more detailed, produces a high-level architecture, solution design. That will go to a series of BAs that will make sure it has all the right subject matter experts and expertise and all the right integration points with the business, and then they'll write a huge spec for it, and then it gets handed down to a developer, and developers just, at that sort of stage, is kind of a glorified data entry clerk, because they just don't go, okay, boss, just do what you say. Getting back to that outcome model and having all the different business units and little blocks that you see in an organization interacting with each other about what they want, not how they want it, elevates software engineers up and out of that lowest level stack and puts them at the front and center of solving for those outcomes. Right, we talk a lot about, how do we get our engineers closer to the problem? How do they get them interacting with the consumer? How do we get them interacting with the stakeholders? The most effective way to do that is actually to stop talking about stop talking about how something will be implemented, and focus more about what is going to be implemented. That said, though, well, actually, first I want to give you an actual example of how this came to life in CBA, because it can sound, hopefully the concept is kind of clear, right? Focus on what, not how, but the power of it hopefully comes through in this example. When I joined the bank, I quickly learnt the nature of risk appetite, and how that plays a central role in virtually everything we do. It felt like, and this was just sort of my own feeling of the conversations I was having, it felt very much like when I would interact with various parts of the business, the conversation would turn to, show me what you've done, and I'll tell you why I don't like it. And we would come back and say, okay, we heard your feedback, we've done this. No, not like that. No, this is why I don't like that. And that's not, and there's not an indictment against the people that come back to you with here's the problems, right? Ultimately, there is large parts of an organization that adopt a defensive posture, and that's how they operate. They're there to mitigate risk. They're there to mitigate cybersecurity risk, non-financial risk, et cetera, et cetera. And the way they mitigate risk is they point out where those problems are, and they introspect the work that you're doing and give feedback on what needs to change. The challenge is when you have an organization where you are incentivizing one set of teams to deliver those outcomes and incentivizing another set of teams to make sure that those outcomes are fully mitigated of any risk, you end up in something like a corporate embodiment of poor Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill, where I feel like I'm paid to get really good at rolling that stone up the hill, while the rest of the organization is sometimes feels like they're paid to make that hill higher and higher for me as I roll. So we tried to lean into that and say, how do we use technology and software engineering in particular to break that sort of cycle of constantly feeling like we've got to produce and be reviewed, produce and be reviewed. And we did this really interesting sort of project where we sat down and thought, hang on, everything we do is, or everything that happens out there in terms of what lands in our customers' hands in terms of whether it be an app or whether it be a venture that we're doing with X15, whether it be a new feature in the CommBank app, there is a series of events that happens and everything is interconnected. It is a hyper-connected graph, right? From the moment I check a bit of code into a repo, to watching someone do a pull request, to watching the CI/CD pipeline build that, to watching someone approve the release to production, all of those steps, and that's just a little part of it, there's a series of interconnected events, and we thought this lends itself to a graph. And so we took all the webhooks out of Jira, we took all the webhook data coming out of GitHub, we took it out of a couple of sources out of Azure, because that's where we were hosting things, and we wrote some software to construct a graph database that showed the exact sequence of events from when someone changed a file to then, so that would be your vertice, and then you'd have the edge to, then that was committed, then you would have an edge to the pull request that was open, then you'd have an edge to the approver of that pull request, and that person would then have a number of edges off there to other pull requests they'd performed. The pull request would show an edge to say that's how this branch landed in, or this branch was merged into main. Here's the CI that kicked off. Here's the artifact that's created. So it created this really nice graph. And then we sat down with the risk team and said, what rules could we codify in this graph that if a particular condition was present and it raised an exception, how could we engineer that sort of logic to codify all the things you would otherwise want to be looking at when you're reviewing our artifacts, such that instead we've got this automated system that is passively watching what's happening and raising those exceptions in real time. And that was a huge sort of eye-opening moment for them. They were like, this is awesome. This makes so much sense. And so we did. We sat down and wrote down a couple of different simple rules. For example, basic stuff, right? Every pull request has to have one or two approvers. There's a certain level of entropy required in the pull request approvers in any given project. So it's not just me approving every single pull request. We wanted an exception raise if a change reached the main branch for which we couldn't find a linked Jira ticket, so that we could make sure that there was business justification for these changes. Simple stuff, right? And easy to code up. But when you code these up and turn these into software-based solutions, it's an example of where you break that model of the otherwise traditional practice of produce an artifact, produce documentation, get it reviewed, get the review feedback, go and rework your artifact, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, it's also a great example of where software engineering doesn't belong just at the bottom of the stack in the organization. Instead, software engineering is more like a capability that you think of being present increasingly in every function in the organization. The risk team itself, for example, or even the cybersecurity team, or even the finance team, they have a whole host of problems that are ripe for automation through software or implementation of software-based solutions, which becomes possible when we stop thinking of software engineering as just a standalone function, but instead something that you embed into each organization. Now that said, you can't just pour software engineers onto an existing organization. Right? We've tried this, right? It doesn't produce long-term effects. You get a quick sort of bump in what feels like progress and excitement. There's a lot of new bodies, there's a lot of new people, there's a lot of new talk of things being done. But people get disgruntled quickly when the rest of the org is not ready for them. You're probably all familiar with the concept of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? What a human needs. At CBA, we drew up a developer's hierarchy of needs. And we said, look, what does a developer need to be successful in their role? And if you think about it as that pyramid, right? At the base of the pyramid, I need somewhere to write my code. I need somewhere to store my code and collaborate on with my peers. I need somewhere to run that code. That code is going to need data and dependencies and cloud resources like message buses, databases. I'm going to need integrations with other systems. I'm going to need a way to route traffic to that so I can actually expose this to my customers. And when those customers come and use my code or my service, I'm going to need some way to authenticate them and authorize them. So it formed a pretty nice, neat pyramid. And it helped us think about what's actually necessary to make sure that an organization is ready to take that focus towards being more of a software engineering-led culture and software engineering-led organization. And the reality is you have to think about it as the organization is ready once you've got a good story for every layer on that pyramid. And drawing it up as a pyramid helps also, because if you've got problems at that lower level of the stack, they compound and roll up into the higher order. Okay, if you're struggling with, if your organization is struggling with, for example, that sort of place to run my code, the hosting layer, if you fix that alone, that's great. That's a heck of an achievement. But the world's best cloud and hosting environment is kind of useless if just my base ability to write my code on a laptop that is performant and responsive, that cloud layer is going to be lost on me. So we found that good sort of way to think of what does it mean for an organization to be ready to take this journey towards the technology transformation. So I want to pivot now to the next topic. We talked a bit there about the importance of agency and autonomy, right? And the crux of that is getting to that notion of focus on the outcomes, focus on what, not how. And when you do that in an organization, that allows the what to be agreed between the parties, and then the experts on either side of that can go and work out how to implement that best. And that's where the level of, that's how we uplift software engineers into that problem space, because they become the experts that can deliver that outcome. But let's talk about the next subject, which I refer to as subtractive leadership or subtraction, the role of subtraction versus additive practices, right? This one is a learning from my time at CBA and realizing what I was perceiving as different and why it was different and what I've seen work previously versus what I was seeing and what was the disparity. So it was something that was kind of always latent in seeing how culture worked at Apple and AWS, but I hadn't really put the frame of reference on until I got to CBA. My view is that the higher you get in a hierarchy, the higher you ascend in an org chart in a company, the more you need to take a subtractive oath of saying, I will, as I ascend in this org chart, as I get more and more senior, I will apply myself more and more to be subtractive in the nature of the work that I'm doing. As opposed to thinking that as you progress up an org chart, that's when you get more control, you have more clout, more ability to implement particular initiatives, or you're owning this big rollout of this particular technology piece that you've decided. Instead, I think one of the things that's really critical to building that high-performing organization, and is one of the real hard things that you have to stare into and make a conscious effort to try and enact change, is to get leadership to think more in the subtractive sense. As in, how do they identify where the problems are and systematically remove them? How do they get in a mindset of their role being about hearing what's holding people back and fixing that, removing it? How do they systematically dismantle these problems that they're seeing? When you do that, when you have that sort of notion of leadership thinks subtractively, there's a natural counterbalance that happens, which is if the leadership is focused on removing the blockers, dismantling the structures that are holding people back, then it's the lower layers in the organization that start to fill the void, right? As it's almost like you create a vacuum by subtracting all away these problems at the leadership level, and naturally your engineers, your designers, your product owners, etc., they'll fill that gap with more of that bottom-up innovation. And to give you an example of how this plays out at Apple, Apple is obviously known as one of, if not the best product organizations. But the role of leadership there, particularly at sort of the SVP level and the senior director level, was very, very subtractive, right? They at the most, for any given iOS or macOS, watchOS release, the higher leadership was setting the themes, right? They might say, this release, we want it to be all about fitness, for example. It was a big focus recently. But it would begin and end at that thematic level. And once those themes were sort of communicated, and more importantly, why we believe those themes were important to the company, it was up to the engineering managers that owned the 6 to 8 team squads of like the mail team, the calendar team, the accounts and identity team. They would take those themes and define what those tentpole and non-tentpole features were going to be. So it would rise from the bottom up. And then it would be the teams themselves that would go and present this to the leadership and say, hey, based on the theme of what we want to do, one year we had a very strong theme around security and privacy. And so the accounts and authentication team was in my org, and we went and presented to the executives and said, hey, we believe that this year we need to do a two-factor authentication implementation that works for all our 700 million iCloud accounts, and we want to do it with data privacy that keeps customers' data safe from both internal and external actors. And those became the feature set, right? And then management's role then was to say, yes, we agree, that's exactly what we want to see. How can we help? What do you need? How do we, what's going to hold you back, and how do we dismantle those problems? The other way that this manifests, and is really, I think, is very important to have a focus on if you're wanting to enact technological transformation in a business, and this is a great quote out of Andy Grove's book of High Output Management. He talks about decision-making must be done at the lowest competent level in an organization. And that kind of flies in the face of what you see at a lot of organizations. I've sat on plenty of leadership teams where their entire meetings are around making decisions, right? They will present topics, they will deliberate on it, and they'll make a decision. But the problem is, right, if you've hired smart people to be in the teams that are under those executives and those leaders, they're the ones that should be making those decisions. They're the ones that are closer to the problems. They're the one that have the on-the-ground knowledge of this. They're the ones that are going to be ultimately enacting the solutions and driving this forward. They're the ones that should be making those decisions, not the leadership team. So I always love that quote from Andy, that the decisions should be made at the lowest competent level in an organization. An example of how we try to apply this at CBA, we've recently launched a venture called Kit. I'm not sure if anyone's seen it. It's a youth finance app. It's got a great sort of interaction model, and it's really fun to use. Its purpose is basically to digitize the bank of mum and dad, which is something very near and dear to me. When we started that project, we sat down with the whole X15 Ventures leadership team and said, look, we want to do this differently. And one of the things we fundamentally want to do differently is change the nature of how decision-making is done around this premise of finding that lowest competent level in the organization that was the right level to be empowered to make decisions, and have them actually make those decisions themselves. And it was kind of a little bit of a farcical thing at first, but sometimes you've got to overcorrect to steer the ship. We started getting everyone, when they came to a meeting, to actually self-identify as to whether you are an approver, a contributor, or an advisor. Because you'd be amazed how often an advisor wears an approver's clothes and an approver wears an advisor's clothes, and ultimately it's probably the contributor that should really be the one that is providing the approval and the decision-making. So it was an example of where in CBA, right, it's not, we're not just a boring bank. We actually lean into these problems and think about creative ways to solve them. And that one worked quite well. It actually did unearth opportunities where there was far more decision-making capability in the organization that we otherwise wouldn't have known about. And elevated them and gave them the job satisfaction of actually owning those decisions that they were then enabled to enact. And I think it was a key element in how we turned around in 10 months an idea of we need a youth banking proposition here to help parents. And I think 10 months later, they had it out in market, complete with a card integration, et cetera. That's huge for a bank. But there's a caveat to this notion of subtractive leadership, right? And one of those caveats that I want to call out is the importance of vision, mission, and purpose. This is one thing that actually perhaps should be added and should be provided at leadership levels. I sat down a long time ago, actually, with the MD of a very successful venture building company in Australia, and explained to him how I was thinking about approaching some of the aspects of venture building. And he sort of had a smirk on his face. He said, "That's never going to work." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you need to have magisterial thinking and you need to have ministerial thinking." I was like really blown away by this. I was like, "What does that mean?" He said, "In any venture or any initiative or any time you are trying to produce something of value, you've got to have someone that is magisterial in the way they work. They own the vision, it's their way or the highway, right? The founder role, right? The person that will sweat this thing till the nth degree and accept no compromises. They've found their hill, they'll die on it if they have to. That's how they think. As opposed to ministerial thinking, which is when once we know what we are going to do and why it's important and what the founder wants to see, what the magistrate and the magisterial thinker wants, then as a committee we can form ideas around the best way to deliver that, and that's when multiple voices do come together to produce a better outcome. But the learning for me there was that, and I retrospectively stepped back and thought, okay, hang on, can I apply that to all the things I've seen happen over my career and prove that out? And the answer was a resounding yes. Every time I've been involved in shipping a really successful product or a feature, there's always been one person who is like the holder of the vision for this, the person that just does not relent. I've had the pleasure of being in that position a few times. I've had the pleasure of working with people that are that person. And it's incredibly important. And I think it's something that sometimes gets a little bit lost in larger organizations where there's just an inherent bias towards that more ministerial way of thinking. Because I think we mistake sometimes that group way of solving problems will get a better outcome, right? Many voices is important, diversity in thinking is important, and it absolutely is, okay? No substitute for one person holding the vision. Right? It's as simple as, you need that one person that knows exactly what they want and why they want it, and then you can surround them with a team of people that as a group will deliver that solution. And we use this to great effect at Apple, for example, right? Apple survives on this concept of the DRI, the directly responsible individual. For every single project, initiative, feature that we shipped, there was always one DRI. Right? For example, if you've ever signed into your iCloud account and you get your two-factor authentication, we launched that in around 2015. That was something I was the DRI for. Right? And I had to make sure that we did not compromise. We got a two-factor auth system that worked beautifully for hundreds of millions of users. And that became my role. Right? It became my role to hold the baton of that, to hold the vision of it's got to work for everyone. It's got to be seamless. And that's important because otherwise it's very easy for committees to unwittingly and unconsciously accept more of lowest common denominator thinking. Right? Sure, you could have had a two-factor authentication system that was based on SMSing out a random code, but no, I had a stronger vision for that. I wanted a system that was actually cryptographically secure, not able to be, it wasn't at the whims of SIM swapping, it wasn't at the whims of SS7 hijacking. But that sort of strive for greatness doesn't happen unless you find that one person who's going to own that vision. At CBA, we are starting this process with this community of distinguished engineers. Right? We've hired, I think we're at about 5 or 6 externally hired distinguished engineers now, some internal promotions as well. The external folks we've brought in all come from very traditional and very large prominent tech companies. And that's not just because we wanted those names associated with CBA. It's because each of us comes with that same mentality of understanding what it takes to deliver an amazing outcome within a large organization. And an understanding that to drive that level of change within an organization like CBA, it's going to require us to be the people that hold that vision, right? Particularly as we think about engineering, right? As it's up to me in my area in the retail bank, my colleague in the business bank, my other colleague in the ComSec, to be the vision of what engineering should look like in those areas and to not accept any compromise. Once you've got, we've talked about the importance of agency and autonomy to give your organizations the right structure and separating the what from the how. We talked about what's necessary in terms of a bit of a mind shift, quite a significant mind shift in some cases in leadership to reach the point where you can become a great tech organization. The next one I want to talk about is then, the organization itself reorienting to be ready to become a leading, high-performing, revered, long-lasting software engineering organization. And I touched on it a little bit before, right? It's like when I joined CBA, in the retail bank, we had a technology team that was largely just a delivery mechanism for features. And it's a very disempowering organization structure when you feel like all you're there to do is to take a spec and implement it, right? I think ultimately, like if we were to boil this down to what has to change in an organization to go from a organization that is leveraging technology well to being an organization that is founded on the notion that technology is at the core of everything they do and the enabler for doing something great, then that key change is taking that bottom layer of software engineers and realizing that that's not just a layer that should exist over there to deliver what we want. It's actually a strength. It is almost like a muscle memory or a capability that has to be supplanted into each parts of the organization. And even if even in areas that you wouldn't necessarily think of being needed for software engineering, right? We're a bank, so we do a whole lot of manual paper processing of applications. Now, in a traditional view, you would staff that out with operations people that would handle that paperwork and process it accordingly. But that's an example of where if you sprinkle in some software engineers to try and solve this problem, they'll quickly find a way to automate that process, to digitize that process and make that happen. But if they do that from within that organizational construct, you get a much better result versus a traditionally manual process-based team having to cry out for help and having to bargain with a software engineering organization that could be completely separate in org structure. That's very hard to navigate when you have such an org structure in place that puts the software engineers off over there and not embedded into the actual problem spaces. When we talk about reorienting the organization like that, I think one of the lessons that's been very interesting for me is that there's a danger here that this becomes a bit of a us versus them, software engineering versus other job functions. And it's an unhealthy tension in a lot of ways. And I wanted to sort of touch on the way in which we sort of looked at this at CBA and really dived into this to avoid the culture clash that can otherwise happen once you sort of, we message a lot about how we're transforming to being a software engineering organization and software engineering led, which sounds great if you're a software engineer. It is somewhat concerning for every other job function. And so it's an important call out that, as to highlight this example, engineering versus architecture can very quickly become a very contentious point, right? Architecture traditionally has the role of defining exactly what's going to be implemented, how it will be implemented, the technologies that will be used. Here's the solution. Engineers go make it happen. When we try to pivot towards being more of a software engineering-led organization, the aim is absolutely not to lower the importance of architecture, but rather to take this as an opportunity to look across all the job functions and say, how do we set up the right peer relationships between these to get great success? And in fact, working with the architecture community at CBA, it's been a really positive outcome because they now see, the benefit of architecture as a forward-looking organization that is defining patterns and direction and ensuring cohesion amongst the group, and actually not having to get caught up in the weeds of the actual technology choices, the specifics of the implementation, and instead, again, focusing on the outcome and allowing engineers to deliver on that. The other thing I wanted to touch on here in terms of learnings about how an existing organization transforms into a really amazing software engineering-focused organization is the nature of these matrixed organizations that seem to come out of the woodwork everywhere. We can all thank Spotify for the crews and tribes model, and then everyone's latched onto that. Like, that makes so much sense. I've got my verticals for my reporting structure and my sort of ownership. I've got my horizontal for my common job tasks, so they'll make sure they're consistent. It looks really great on paper, I won't deny. Okay? One of the things I wanted to highlight as a learning, having seen organizations go through that and having seen an organization function very, very well without any of that, is that a matrix organization is actually a relatively complex embodiment of a simple concept. The simple concept at play here is, for every one of us within an organization, there is what you own, what you're accountable for, and there's what you influence. And they're not the same thing. There's a Venn diagram at play here, right? There is two circles, they overlap in the middle. This is the circle of things that I own, the circle of things that I influence, and where they intersect, there's me. But the importance of understanding that there's a difference between what you own and what you're accountable for and what you influence puts you in that mode of navigating organizational structures in a way that I think those matrix organizations try to make possible for, without necessarily explaining the fundamental premise that's at work. And what I've seen go kind of wrong with these matrix organizations is there's a level of rigidity that forms in them that actually prevents the growth of people that otherwise would have happened, or was perhaps the goal of that matrix organization in the first place. When you think of it more in the commons, the really simple sense that I just said of there's what you own and there's what you influence, if you think about what career progression looks like, career progression and an increase in seniority and scope of role is actually both of those circles in that Venn diagram expanding outwards, right? Hopefully in equal measure. And we've got to be careful in these matrixed organizations that you don't accidentally butt up against the horizontal levels and the vertical levels. These matrixed organizations, they fail to account for somewhat of a diagonal move throughout organizations. For example, taking that DRI concept at Apple, there was a lot of products that I was responsible for, or features that I was responsible for, where I had a lot of input into and a lot of connection with the actual product design itself. And I think it's something to be mindful of when we look at these matrix organizations, to think about, okay, yes, the engineering chapter is great because that gives us a really strong cross-connect across all the engineering teams for commonality, sharing tool sets, sharing learnings. And then we have the product horizontal, which is where all our product owners share their learnings about how to structure products, etc. But they don't necessarily account for what happens when an engineer actually has a bit of an interest in product, or a product person wants to have more input or understanding of the engineering silo. So just that one's more of just a learning to share that it's increasingly becoming the norm that the way in which technology transformation happens seems to be with two almost universal ingredients. One, we adopt Agile. Two, we've got a matrix organization of squads and tribes and practices, etc., that whatever you want to hear. I encourage folks to think about it in a more simple sense of the Agile process is good in terms of what it does for setting up autonomy of the teams, those constant incrementing because you own it end to end. The matrix organization is great for ensuring commonality, but there's a need in an organization as you want to reach to the next sort of level of becoming a really great software engineering organization to make sure that you haven't built too much of a rigid structure in that matrix organization. We've just gone through this in CBA. We've rolled out our version of a scaled Agile matrix organization. It's been, I think it's probably the biggest evidence that there is a huge transformation happening within the group. And it has done an amazing job of helping teams that otherwise felt like they were just sort of islands, now connecting amongst their peers and their peers doing similar job functions but across completely different areas of the business. So just a quick recap before we launch into the last section here. Agency and autonomy, super important to make sure that your teams know what they're responsible for and they feel like they can control their destiny. Instilling a sense of subtractive leadership to make sure that leadership understands their role is not to make the decisions, their role is not to make the technology choices and roll out these big programs. Their role is actually to understand what's holding their people back and systematically dismantle and remove that from the organization. The combination of those two things sets you up to start reorienting your organization, where we no longer think of software engineers as a standalone function, and we think instead of software engineers as a capability that we want integrated into all aspects of our business. But there's got to be a vehicle for this, and that vehicle is the culture of the organization. The benefit of achieving those things that I just mentioned, those sort of 4 key ingredients, is that you get problem solving at scale. You get the ability to solve many, many problems that are existing across the organization quickly, and with solutions that are tightly integrated into that problem space, and that helps an organization move at a very, very rapid scale with avoiding the bottleneck of software as a delivery function. The culture is the vehicle through which you make that happen. The best definition I've ever heard of what culture is, because it's such an ambiguous and vague sort of amorphous topic, the best definition I've ever heard of it is a shared understanding of how things get done, which I think works nicely because it speaks to the collective unconscious nature of it. It is something that permeates between people. It's not necessarily something that is tangible and written, but it transcends across a group of people. It's that shared understanding, but it's a shared understanding of how something gets done. And there is, if you could definitely pull me up on that and say, hold on, why are we doing a shared understanding of how things get done? You said at the start of this we should be focusing on what, not how. So there's a little caveat here. The shared understanding of how things get done is different to the how is in the implementation. Right? A culture should not be about we use Kong because that's what our culture is based on, or we are primarily an Azure primary cloud organization. That's not culture. Right? That is a how, that's an implementation. Hopefully there's a really strong outcome of why you're doing that. The cultural aspect of the shared understanding of how things gets done is what decision-making process happened. What was the distributed decision-making framework that existed in the heads of many, many people that got us to those decisions that were made. That, to me, is the nature of culture. And I've experienced 2 very, very, very different cultures in my time working in the US. You cannot imagine 2 polar opposites than Apple and AWS. Right? Apple is, everything is for the love of the product. We don't have to be first to market. In fact, we're more often than not first to market, but we go to market with something that we absolutely love and it's fantastic and it's great. But we'll wait until it is. Okay. AWS, good enough, get it out the door, move on to the next thing, enable great things to happen, do the 20% of work to get to the 80% of the result, move on, right? Really rapid development of incredible, world-changing, enabling technologies, but a fundamentally different ethos in culture. And to be clear, I loved both of them. The lesson that I took from examining those 2 cultures was a realization that culture exists in 2 separate forms. There is intrinsic culture and there is extrinsic culture. Intrinsic culture is the thing that you just know and just happens without any external force at all. Right? There's no poster at Apple that says, we won't ship first, we will just make sure we ship the best thing. There's no poster at Apple or there's no written mandate that says, we will be the surprise and delight is our absolute goal. We just knew it. Everyone knew it. It's why you were there. It was fundamentally why everyone showed up to work and why we did what we did. That's intrinsic culture. Now, an extrinsic culture is something that exists and has a lot of external force behind it to try and affect a change. And this is where AWS has done an amazing job of starting with an extrinsic cultural element that became so deeply integrated into their culture that it became intrinsic. And what I'm referring to is their leadership principles. From the moment you start your interview process with AWS, if you do not know those leadership principles off by heart, you have absolutely no hope. Because even the interviews, you know, right? Someone walks in and starts interviewing you, 3 or so questions in, you go, okay, this is the bias for action guy, right? Okay, well, now I know what he's looking for. Then someone walks in and you say, this must be the disagree and commit lady. Okay, cool, that's what this topic is, right? It's fundamental to what they do, but it's also very extrinsic. Those principles were written down at a point in time, they were messaged out to the organization, and they were continually applied and integrated into what happened. But they become intrinsic because they have become so well integrated into the culture, it's so well integrated into the practices, that without someone having posters on the wall or a little tag on your badge with these principles, you knew them and you would apply them. It was very, very common in a meeting for someone to actually say, hang on, stop guys, we need to get to disagree and commit on this, okay? We're not getting to anywhere, let's actually, by name enact that leadership principle and do it. Really, really fascinating to see that come to life, because it also brought to life for me a pattern that I saw where this didn't work. So in late 99, early 2000s, I went to work at Cisco. And Cisco at the time, you would wear your badge, and behind your badge would be about 2 or 3 plastic cards. And one of them was the values card. And the only value I can ever remember from there was frugality. And that was more because you were experiencing it every day in your life working there. They were a very, very frugal company. But it's an example of where an extrinsic element of culture failed to become an intrinsic element because it wasn't deeply integrated. Okay, yes, we printed it on cards. Yes, it was attached to your badge. Yes, you would therefore see it 2 or 3 times a day. But it wasn't integrated into the practice. Right? There weren't meetings ever when someone said, hold on a second, let me just, let's apply Principle 7 here so we can move forward. Right? So that was a really interesting learning for me to see what happens, what is the nature of culture in those extrinsic and intrinsic sort of senses, and because you can't just create an intrinsic culture, right? You can't just somehow, it'd be great if you could, but you cannot just somehow magically create a shared understanding amongst a bunch of people about how something should be done. You've got to demonstrate that. You've got to introduce the change. You've got to apply force and effort over and over again to integrate that more deeply into the work practices. Starts intrinsic, becomes intrinsic. And a lesson that they taught us at Apple to try and bring this to life was that, one of the ways that the intrinsic culture manifested itself so well in Apple was, for example, everyone would live on the daily builds of whether you're working on iOS or Mac OS, right? It was just standard practice. You'd come in the morning, you'd plug your phone in, you'd drop the latest iOS build on there, you'd live on it, you'd file the bugs, you'd go and see the team down the hallway, and you'd say, hey, look at this weird thing that the Mail app's doing. That was just part of our culture. That's how we built amazing products, because we lived on it, we loved what we were doing, we cared about it so deeply that you'd file the bug and you'd go and follow up with the team. It was just there in the culture. But so if you look at that as like, okay, fine, that's 2 ways that we create culture, but like why? Why is the culture important? First of all, it is a vehicle of change, right? When you've got that shared understanding of how things get done, and you have the ability to introduce a change in that shared understanding of how things get done, that's how you can enact broad sweeping changes throughout an organization. It takes time, but it's the vehicle through which you do this. The other thing that is really important to an organization is it prevents the normalization of deviation. Apple has a part in the campus called Apple University. It was run by the former dean of Harvard and Kim Scott, who wrote Radical Candor. They take new managers through a multi-week course on the Challenger disaster. And it's, like, for me as a space nerd, it's like fascinating stuff to look into. But it's also an amazingly important organizational lesson, right, of why you must avoid normalization of deviation, right? Why did that disaster happen? It happened because the shuttle had launched 3 or 4 times in incredibly cold weather. So the reasoning was, there was no problems last time, it'll be fine this time, okay? And systematically, that became ingrained in the culture at Morton Thiokol and all the other contractors. It was this notion of, yeah, there is specs and there is a set of rules we should adhere to, but we deviated from that, nothing broke, it's okay. Culture becomes the antidote to that, right? It becomes, if you've got that strongly ingrained culture that you're trying to create in an organization, not only does it become that vehicle through which change happens, but it becomes that defense mechanism against the normalization of those deviations. At CBA, we're definitely at the start of that extrinsic level at the moment, okay? Almost to the point where we are trying to enact through active effort and through integration of practices the change in what is the intrinsic culture towards a more software engineering-led high-performance organization. And I find that exciting. Right? These are the kind of challenges that you won't find elsewhere in software engineering. Yes, you can go work at a startup and you can enjoy the table tennis and the free snacks and all that good stuff. Great, done that, it's fun, I love it. You can go to a scale-up and work out how you take something that's really ramping up and can serve the world. When you're ready to take that next leap, I encourage you to dive into an organization where, like I said at the start, it's not yet somewhere where you can do the best work of your life. Because there is challenges in there that you won't find in a startup. There's an ability to hone your skills and develop your abilities to negotiate, to communicate, to problem solve, to work out how to interact with people that you won't find in these other organizations. That's what I find really thrilling about the role that I'm in. I'm going to leave you very quickly with a piece of advice I got recently and has become one of my most near and dear learnings. Hopefully what I've just talked to you about in the last hour or so are things that resonate with you in terms of, that's either something that I want to see change in our company, or that's an interesting idea, I wonder if we could apply that here. My advice here, and this was the advice I got recently when I walked out of a meeting and I was incredibly frustrated. I was just completely worn down and over the whole thing. And a dear colleague of mine came up to me and said, "You know why you're so frustrated?" And I I nearly launched into a tirade of exactly why I was so frustrated. Thankfully, he caught me and said, "You're so frustrated because you have in your mind the exact configuration of the chessboard when you win the chess game that you're playing." I was like, "Yeah, of course I do. I know exactly what I want to do. I know what I want to get done." Yes. He says, "Yeah, that's why you're frustrated. We can win the chess game myriad different ways. That configuration of the board that you want to win and you think is your winning chessboard, beautiful, right? Great set of moves, demonstrates your skill and finesse. Forget about it. What matters is the next move you will make, and then the next move you will make, and then the next move you will make. Your ability to be successful, to get towards the outcome you're striving for, is not to get fixated on what the chessboard will look like when you win, but to work out from move to move how you're going to incrementally apply these principles, little by little, piece by piece, to incrementally move you towards that winning position." And it actually comes from a book called Enterprise Architecture as Chess, which just blew me away that there is actually a book called Enterprise Architecture as Chess, but I encourage you to look it up. Folks, thank you very much for spending the last hour with me. It's been a pleasure to talk, and look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.